He was a man in a tailored suit, dragged through the streets by a furious mob. He was not a murderer, he was not a thief, he was the sitting mayor of the city. A rope was thrown over a traffic light and tightened around his neck for one single reason. He told the crowd to let the law do its job. History holds a terrifying truth. Sometimes, the most vicious force in a society is not a ruthless killer, but an ordinary community that decides to become the executioner. The year was 1919. Across the United States, the months stretching from late spring to early autumn would be recorded in history under a grim moniker, the Red Summer. It was a season defined by sweltering temperatures and the widespread, systemic fracturing of racial peace. Omaha, Nebraska, positioned on the western bank of the Missouri River, presented itself as a beacon of Midwestern progress. It was a booming industrial hub, fueled by the relentless machinery of rail yards and the sprawling, blood-soaked floors of meat-packing plants. But the prosperity of Omaha was a fragile veneer. Beneath the smoke of the factories lay deep, structural tensions. Soldiers returning from the First World War found their old jobs occupied by newly arrived Southern black migrants and Eastern European immigrants. The local press, most notably the Omaha Bee, had spent months running inflammatory headlines, methodically stoking the fears of its white readership with sensationalized reports of crime. The city was a powder keg of economic anxiety and racial animosity, waiting only for a single spark. Moving quietly through the shadows of this turbulent economic engine was a man named Will Brown. He was 41 years old, a packing house worker who lived a life defined by hard labor and profound invisibility. Will Brown was not a man built for conflict. He suffered from severe, crippling rheumatism. His joints were swollen, his daily movements characterized by a slow, agonizing stiffness. For a black man in a heavily segregated Midwestern city, survival meant keeping a low profile and avoiding the gaze of a society that was increasingly hostile to his existence. That quiet existence ended abruptly on the evening of September 25th. A young white woman named Agnes Lobeck and her companion reported that they had been ambushed and assaulted by an unidentified black man while walking near her home. The local authorities, pressured by a restless public, began searching the surrounding neighborhoods. Within hours, the accusation was directed entirely at Will Brown. The case against him was built on a foundation of error. There was no forensic examination conducted. There was no physical evidence tying him to the location of the crime. There was no third-party witness to corroborate the events or confirm the identity of the attacker. Furthermore, the physical reality of Brown's severe rheumatism made the violent, agile nature of the assault highly improbable. Yet, in the deeply prejudiced judicial atmosphere of 1919, a black man accused by a white woman was a scenario where rigorous evidence was often considered a secondary, almost unnecessary requirement. The police moved swiftly, driven more by a desperate need to maintain civic order than by a pursuit of meticulous investigation. Will Brown was arrested and transported to the Douglas County Courthouse. The courthouse was a formidable, modern structure of heavy stone and reinforced steel, an imposing architectural promise that the rule of law would be upheld. Brown was placed in a secure cell on the top floor. The authorities believed that the thick walls of the county jail would be enough to insulate the prisoner from the mounting anger outside, buying them the time needed to organize a formal, impartial trial. They operated under the assumption that the citizens of Omaha still respected the institution of justice. But stone and steel are poor fences against a community that has already made up its mind. Have you ever wondered how quickly a civilized city can descend into absolute madness? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Outside the courthouse doors, the afternoon air had begun to shift. The rumors had already outpaced the sparse facts of the case, bleeding rapidly through the streets, the packing houses, and the saloons. Men were leaving their shifts, gathering in small knots on the street corners, their conversations growing louder, their grievances merging into a single, unified target. The law was methodically preparing for a trial. The city, however, was preparing for something else entirely. As the late afternoon sun began to dip below the Omaha skyline, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement, the physical reality outside the Douglas County Courthouse underwent a terrifying transformation. What had started shortly after noon as a restless, murmuring gathering of a few dozen men had steadily swelled into the hundreds. It drew workers fresh off their grueling shifts from the Union Pacific rail yards and the sprawling meatpacking plants, men with calloused hands and lingering frustrations. By nightfall, the streets surrounding the heavy stone building were completely choked with a surging, chaotic mass of more than 4,000 people. The sheer volume of the crowd fundamentally altered the atmosphere of the city blocks. It replaced the ordinary rhythmic hum of urban commerce with a low, collective roar of anticipated violence, an unmistakable sound that signaled the rapid disintegration of civic order. In the fading light of that September evening, a dark and well-documented psychological alchemy took hold. The thousands of individuals standing shoulder to shoulder on the street ceased to operate as independent citizens. They were no longer individual fathers, brothers, or factory hands bound by personal morality. They had seamlessly merged into a single, terrifying organism. The psychology of the mob is not simply an aggregation of angry people. It is a profound, intoxicating surrender of personal responsibility to a collective, predatory instinct. This entity did not require verified facts, nor did it possess the capacity for measured reason. It was sustained entirely by whispered exaggerations and outright fabrications that rippled through the ranks like an electric current. Every time a rumor was passed from one man to another, the alleged crime grew more gruesome, the necessary vengeance more absolute. The mob was no longer demanding a thorough investigation into the allegations against Will Brown. They had already appointed themselves as the supreme authority, bypassing the courtroom entirely to act as both jury and executioner. Standing between this massive breathing weapon and the prisoner locked away on the top floor was a remarkably small, increasingly desperate contingent of Omaha police officers. Realizing with sickening clarity that they were vastly outnumbered and entirely outgunned, the officers retreated inward and heavily barricaded the perimeter of the courthouse. They locked the massive iron doors, dragged heavy furniture to block the lower-level entrances, and positioned themselves in the darkened hallways with their weapons drawn. At that specific moment in 1919, those few men sweating in the corridors of the Douglas County Courthouse represented the final, incredibly fragile boundary between a functioning civilized society and absolute anarchy. They were technically defending a structure of stone and steel, but fundamentally, they were desperately trying to defend the very concept of due process against a populace that had decided it was no longer necessary. The locked doors and fortified windows, however, did not deter the thousands waiting outside. The physical resistance only served to escalate the frenzy. The assault began with a relentless barrage of paving stones, bricks, and heavy debris torn from the nearby streets. These projectiles were hurled with blinding fury, shattering the tall glass windows of the lower floors and raining jagged, lethal shards onto the officers positioned inside. When the stones proved insufficient to breach the reinforced entrances, factions of the mob splintered off and descended upon the surrounding commercial district like a swarm. They systematically broke into nearby pawn shops, hardware stores, and sporting goods suppliers, stripping the shelves bare. They emerged into the night carrying hundreds of rifles, shotguns, and heavy boxes of ammunition. The confrontation had instantly evolved from a localized riot into an armed militant siege. A continuous, deafening volley of gunfire erupted against the stone facade of the courthouse, the bullets chipping away at the architectural embodiment of justice. Hours passed, and the heavy iron doors of the courthouse miraculously held fast against the relentless ballistic barrage. Inside, the air grew thick with smoke and the metallic smell of gunpowder. Outside, frustration mounted within the crowd, quickly mutating into a ruthless elemental strategy. If they could not break through the thick stone walls to claim the victim they sought, They would simply eradicate the building itself. Men rushed forward through the gunfire with stolen cans of gasoline, methodically dousing the lower floors, the window frames, and the heavy wooden doorways. Matches were struck, and the very foundation of the structure was ignited. Flames quickly latched onto the architecture, crawling upward and casting a hellish, flickering light over the thousands of upturned, shouting faces watching from the street below. It was a profound statement of societal failure. They were perfectly willing to burn down their own city's symbol of law, order, and civilization, entirely content to reduce the physical halls of justice to ash, just to satisfy an overwhelming collective thirst for blood. Inside the burning Douglas County courthouse, the air was growing thick and unbreathable. The lower floors were actively being consumed by flames, and the structural integrity of the local legal system was quite literally turning to ash. Amidst this suffocating chaos, Omaha's sitting executive, Mayor Edward Smith, made a decision born of desperate courage. He believed, perhaps naively, in the lingering power of his office. He believed that the 4,000 constituents raging outside were still rational citizens capable of being reasoned with. Leaving the barricaded safety of the upper floors, Smith stepped out through the front doors and directly into the nightmare, intending to negotiate for the life of Will Brown and the preservation of his city's soul. This exact moment serves as a chilling historical case study in the anatomy of a collapsing society. In the daylight, under normal circumstances, the title of mayor carries an invisible armor. It commands deference, backed by the implicit structural threat of state power and constitutional order. But standing on those stone steps, illuminated by the hellish glow of torches and burning gasoline, that invisible armor completely evaporated. The mob looking back at him did not see an elected leader or a respected figure of authority. They saw only an inconvenient obstacle. When collective hysteria reaches its absolute boiling point, political titles, institutional power, and the written law are immediately rendered meaningless. Mayor Smith raised his hands over the roar of the crowd, demanding they disperse and allow the justice system to perform its sworn duty. The mob's response was an immediate, overwhelming wave of physical violence. Instead of listening to reason, the front ranks surged up the steps and swallowed the mayor whole. He was struck violently in the head with a heavy projectile. His tailored suit was torn to shreds as hundreds of hands grabbed at him, pulverizing the man who dared to stand between them and their chosen victim. They threw the highest-ranking official in Omaha down the heavy stone steps, dragging his bleeding body out onto the unforgiving pavement of Harney Street. What happened next was an act of such brazen, horrifying desecration that it effectively erased the local government in a matter of seconds. The rioters had brought ropes, fully intending to use them on the prisoner trapped inside the building. Now, they simply repurposed their tools. At a busy intersection, they threw a heavy hemp rope over the crossarm of a traffic signal pole. They slipped the noose tightly around the mayor's neck and hoisted him into the air. Edward Smith, the chief executive sworn to protect the city and uphold its laws, was left dangling and suffocating above the street, actively being lynched by the very people who had voted him into office. He was suspended on the absolute brink of death, his vision fading to black as the mob cheered in triumph beneath his kicking feet. But the timeline of history occasionally hinges on the desperate, split-second actions of a few individuals. In a fleeting, chaotic window of opportunity, a small squad of city detectives violently rammed their way through the packed, distracted crowd. Operating purely on adrenaline, they fought their way to the base of the pole and slashed the taut rope with a knife. They caught the unconscious mayor as he plummeted to the ground, violently shoved his battered body into a waiting police vehicle, and sped away toward a local hospital while bullets shattered the car's windshield. Edward Smith miraculously survived the night, but his dramatic rescue offered absolutely no salvation for the people he had left behind. The brief, brutal hanging of the mayor carried a devastating message that echoed back into the burning courthouse. When a mob publicly demonstrates that it is perfectly willing to execute the highest protector of the law simply for asking them to respect it, a terrifying new reality takes hold. The exhausted police officers and the terrified prisoner trapped behind the iron doors finally understood the cold truth of their situation. The law was officially dead, and they had just been stripped of every single human right they thought they possessed. The fire inside the Douglas County courthouse had grown from a localized threat into a towering, uncontrollable inferno. The smoke was thick and blinding, rapidly filling the upper corridors where the remaining police officers and their prisoners were securely trapped. The architectural pride of Omaha was literally collapsing around them, the intense heat warping the heavy steel bars and shattering the remaining glass. Faced with the imminent, horrifying prospect of burning to death inside their own fortress, the authorities made a devastating, final calculation. To save the lives of the many trapped within the municipal structure, they surrendered the one. They unsealed the barricaded doors. They handed Will Brown over to the thousands waiting in the street below, effectively abandoning him to the wolves. There was no interrogation waiting for him in the suffocating heat of the night. There was no desperate plea for innocence, no formal reading of charges, and absolutely no opportunity for Will Brown to utter a single word in his own defense. The roar of 4,000 voices entirely drowned out any possibility of human mercy. In a matter of minutes, the mob stripped away the entire apparatus of American jurisprudence. They delivered and executed a sentence of death that required no presiding judge, no appointed legal counsel, and no deliberating jury. He was killed on the street with a brutal, breathtaking efficiency, his life extinguished by a community that had completely severed its ties to civilization. To view the brutal murder of Will Brown as a tragic, isolated anomaly is a fundamental misunderstanding of American history. What happened in the glow of the burning courthouse in Omaha was not an accident, nor was it a spontaneous aberration of civic behavior. It was merely the localized expression of a sprawling, deeply entrenched national mechanism. The data reveals a chilling, undeniable pattern of terror. According to meticulous historical records, between the years 1882 and 1968, the United States witnessed 4,743 lynchings across its vast territory. Of those documented victims, 3,446 were black men, women, and children. These were not hidden crimes committed in the dark. They were often highly visible, public spectacles. For the people pulling the ropes, this system of mob violence was working exactly as it was designed. This specific phenomenon of collective bloodlust possesses a long, dark, and repetitive lineage. 2 centuries earlier, in the bitter winter of 1692, the Salem witch trials demonstrated the exact same psychological architecture. While the tragedy in Salem clothed its hysteria in the formal garments and wooden benches of a Puritan courtroom, it was fundamentally driven by the same blind collective terror. In 17th century Massachusetts, highly educated magistrates willingly accepted what was known as spectral evidence, the invisible, entirely unprovable claims born from neighborhood gossip and communal paranoia. That specific, localized hysteria ultimately resulted in 19 people being hanged and 1 pressed to death under heavy stones. Whether it is 17th century spectral evidence in New England or 20th century street rumors in the Midwest, the underlying mechanism remains identical. When collective fear and deep-seated prejudice take command, baseless whispers are instantly forged into legally sanctioned weapons of murder. The mob that burned the courthouse and executed a man in Omaha did not view themselves as criminals breaking the law. In their own twisted perception, they were the ultimate enforcers of it. Collective violence of this magnitude is rarely a sudden glitch in the societal machine. It is a deliberate, highly effective instrument of systemic oppression, utilized specifically to keep marginalized population in a state of permanent, paralyzing fear. The system of the mob completely usurped the system of the state, proving that whenever the law is absent or willingly steps aside, the darkest impulses of the crowd will always rise to take its place. In the early hours of the following morning, the rhythmic, heavy march of federal troops finally echoed through the smoldering, debris-lined streets of Omaha. The United States Army had arrived to quell the insurrection and re-establish the physical boundaries of a broken city. Martial law was immediately declared. The remaining crowds were dispersed at bayonet point, and a superficial semblance of civic order was meticulously restored to the Midwestern hub. But military intervention is merely a mechanism for stopping active violence. It cannot resurrect the dead, nor can it retroactively salvage a legal system that has already been willingly surrendered. The soldiers brought a heavy silence to the streets, but justice would never truly return to Omaha. Perhaps the most horrifying artifact to emerge from the ashes of that September night was not the ruined architecture of the courthouse, but a single photograph. It captured the grim aftermath of Will Brown's murder. In the stark, blinding flash of the camera, the faces of the mob were permanently preserved for history. They were not hiding their identities behind hoods or masks. They were looking directly into the lens, standing shoulder to shoulder beside the horrific scene, and they were smiling. It was a portrait of absolute, chilling certainty, the undeniable certainty of a crowd that inherently knows it will never be held accountable by the state, and history proved them entirely correct. Out of the more than 4,000 individuals who actively participated in the violent siege, the orchestrated arson, the attempted murder of Mayor Edward Smith, and the brutal lynching of a man who was never granted a trial, the legal repercussions were practically non-existent. A chaotic, half-hearted attempt at prosecution followed, but it quickly dissolved in the face of a community that refused to testify against itself. Almost no one faced meaningful prison time. The vast majority of the mob simply evaporated back into the mundane fabric of the city. The true terror of this historical chapter lies not just in the violence, but in the seamless, terrifying return to normalcy. The men who had hurled bricks, carried gasoline, and cheered for an execution simply washed the smell of smoke from their clothes. They woke up the next morning and returned to their shifts at the slaughterhouses and the Union Pacific rail yards. They went back to being diligent factory workers, respected business owners, and devoted fathers sitting at their family dinner tables. They lived out the remainder of their lives as if the unspeakable horrors of that night had been nothing more than a collective fever dream. The city actively chose amnesia, burying the memory of its own barbarism under decades of calculated silence. In the years that followed, the Douglas County Courthouse was carefully reconstructed. The fire-blackened stones were repaired, the shattered windows were replaced, and the building rose again, standing even more magnificent and imposing than it had before the riot. It proudly resumed its role as the physical embodiment of the American justice system, a monument to civilization and due process. But as the heavy iron doors reopened to the public, a quiet, haunting question remained permanently suspended in the air. What is the actual value of a grand, fortified building built to symbolize the law, if the ordinary citizens walking through its pristine halls still carry within them the dormant, waiting soul of a torch-bearing mob?